Morning, good afternoon. I'm David Hoffman. Thank you for joining me for this recorded talk about the self-led mediator using IFS in dispute resolution for the IFS conference. It's a pleasure to be part of this conference. I've gotten so much out of the IFS training that I've received. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And I hope you can hear me okay. I'm recording this well in advance of the conference itself. So I'm going to go through a bunch of slides, and I'm pretty confident that through the conference platform, you'll have access to these slides, because I'm going to go pretty fast. And I usually begin with New Yorker cartoons. In this one, the cartoon, I think, is sort of about beginner's mind. It's kind of a amusing take on the idea, a seemingly boastful Buddhist priest. But the concept basically is that in order to learn the things that may be unfamiliar, we try to get the judgy parts of our mind to take a step back and give us a little bit of spaciousness for other parts, learning parts, curious parts to step in. I also love this cartoon about thinking outside the box, especially since I have a cat. I always tell my cat to never think outside the box. But we're going to be doing a little bit of thinking outside the box with regard to the use of IFS in a non-clinical setting, specifically in this case, the setting of mediation. The agenda for this talk is I'm going to share a little bit about my personal background to the extent that it's relevant to this talk. Talk about my journey from thinking about the psychology of mediation through the lens of the DSM to a what I think is a more useful frame, looking at it through the lens of internal family systems model. And then I'm going to get specific about how I've been using it in my mediation practice. First, looking at how IFS helps in working with the client's parts, but also working with my own parts. Then talk a little bit about using IFS as a way to understand our clients' biases and our own biases with regard to race, gender, class, sexual orientation, disability, etc. Okay, so learning objective. Always important to focus on our learning objective. To describe how IFS can be used in mediation. I assume that's why you're watching this video. And second, to use the chat and Q&A functions to educate each other. So this is a new one for me, the idea of using a video with in a webinar setting where our connection will be through the chat. A caveat. Mediators use IFS differently. We're not using it for long-term healing. Mediations involve a few sessions, sometimes only one session. And the focus is more on problem solving than healing exiles and unburdening parts. That said, I think it's been well established at the IFS conferences each year that there are educators and coaches and people from many other walks of life who are using the IFS model, adapting it, of course, to a different setting. There are resources. I believe these are available online through the conference website, but in any event, you'll get the slides, and so you'll have links. At the very end of this talk, you'll see some live links that you can click on when you get a copy of the slides if you decide you want to pursue any of these resources. Some challenges. So just speaking personally, giving a talk at an IFS conference when I'm not a clinician. I've had level 1 training, but only level 1 training. It brings up all kinds of parts that I associate with the concept of imposter complex. There's an exile in there that is afraid of being unmasked as being in over my head and being viewed as not, competent. And they're perfectionist parts that don't like this, Zoom setting where I'm not interacting with you in the way that we do in a live Zoom meeting. There's also a manager in there that is reassuring me and telling me that I'll get useful feedback. Plus, there's a lot of compassion and self-energy in the room. So I think I'm okay with this. I'm also feeling challenged by the fact that there are at least 3 audiences. There are probably some mediators, I hope, who are listening to this, and some therapists, I hope, who are listening to it, and some who are therapists and either currently doing mediation or hoping to do mediation. And so the challenge here is to try to hit the place in this talk that is useful to all 3 of those audiences, people who are very experienced with mediation, people who are very experienced with IFS. I'll do my best. There is an exile there that just wants to please everybody and feels, fear of being shunned and rejected and all that. And a manager that is saying to me, "You're overthinking this, just get on with your talk, it'll be fine." So that's what I'm going to do. Personal background. So I think it's sort of relevant that I started off in life as a hippie woodworker. In terms of my orientation to wanting to make the world a better place, and my background in protesting in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, etc. And also the fact that I wasn't a very good woodworker led me to go to law school. So there I was, heading off to law school. The path not taken, however, was to become a psychotherapist. I very strongly considered that as an option. And I chose law for a variety of practical reasons, and I have no regrets about that. Also, I've noticed that in the work that I do as a mediator, I'm working in a field that is sort of in this middle space between law and psychotherapy. It draws on both of those traditions and practices and disciplines, which is one of the reasons I think that I wound up getting level 1 training in IFS, because I felt the need to learn a lot more about this path, and I'm still on that learning path. I think especially people who've gone to law school, we have a lot to learn from our colleagues who are psychotherapists. That's me on graduation day from law school in 1984. On the left of this picture is my late wife, Beth Andrews. Some of you may even have known Beth because she was an IFS practitioner. She was a psychotherapist. Law school was not a particularly hospitable place to think about, talk about, learn about psychology. I picked out this article with an amusing title because it sort of exemplifies the not so subtle hostility that the law school curriculum and the whole orientation of law training has with regard to emotions. But in spite of that, I didn't learn much about psychology in law school. So this is all kind of post law school graduation learning. And as I said, it continues. So in terms of my day jobs, I have 2. My first is to be a mediator, arbitrator, and an attorney, using my law practice in non-litigation cases. We call it collaborative law. If anybody who wants to know more about that, please contact me or Google it. Happy to talk with you about what collaborative law means. And I practice in Boston. My other day job, there's my crew from a recent retreat, the Boston Law Collaborative folks, very dear colleagues, having a retreat at the Common House at my co-housing community in Acton. The other day job is being a teacher, which I love, and I have the good fortune of teaching 3 courses at Harvard Law School. One is mediation, which I've taught since 2008. The course is still changing and evolving. I'm still trying to figure out how to best teach mediation. And I also teach a course on diversity and dispute resolution and another one on collaborative law in the legal profession program at the law school. I want to nod in the direction of my level 1 co-trainers, co-leaders, Rena Dubin and Mike Elkin, from whom I learned an enormous amount, and also the program assistants who played an invaluable role in my training. I also want to give a shout out to Dick Schwartz, not only for creating the model and being very generous with his time, talking with me about it in connection with an article that I was writing about using IFS for mediation, but also being kind and generous enough to do some trainings with me, to co-lead some trainings for mediators and lawyers. This particular one, we think we've done about 4 or 5 of them. This one, if you look at the fine print, you'll see it was scheduled for March 27th, 2020. That one did not happen, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. But I learned so much from working with Dick, also from, of course, reading his books. Now, I know that in many introductions, it's a good idea to include a fun fact. So I want to mention that during the pandemic, my wife and I, after my wife, Beth Andrews, died, 4 years later, I remarried, and that's my wife, Leslie, who's a career coach. I don't think she would mind my sharing that information. And our pandemic pup, whom we adopted from Serbia, of all places, where they have an abundance of dogs needing homes. And that's Bella and me on a paddleboard. She really likes going around the pond in Eastham, where we love to paddleboard together. Go figure, because she doesn't like to swim, and and even though she's a golden retriever, she doesn't like to retrieve either. But paddleboards, she likes. Okay, so on to our agenda. And now that I've said a little bit about my personal background and some of my parts, I want to talk a little bit about my journey to IFS, because I think it's relevant to the question of why IFS is such a good fit for mediation. So the first point I want to make is that we mediators read this book as sort of our foundational textbook. Getting to Yes is all about interest-based problem solving, expanding the pie to achieve joint gains, looking for principled benchmarks to resolve disputed issues, and considering the bargainers' alternatives to a negotiated agreement. All great stuff. The problem with it, in my view, is that it has a foundation of rationality. All the things that you see in this 5-point bulleted list rely on having a clear-eyed, logical way of thinking about the negotiation. But the reality is our thinking is often distorted by cognitive biases. Wikipedia lists more than 200 of them. The ones I listed here, like confirmation bias, are probably very familiar. The other problem is that we have emotions. And when I got my training as a mediator, one of the things I was told is it's important to let people vent their emotions so that when the steam has left the kettle, now we can make a cup of tea without getting scalded. Well, it turns out that venting emotions is problematic in certain ways, but it's an interesting metaphor, I think. And it also reflects the fact that in the mediation world, like in the world of law, the idea of people using their emotions as part of their negotiation is becoming more common now than it was, for example, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago when mediation first started becoming more widely used in the areas of law and other areas. Putting this book up on the screen because this book really helped me understand what neuroscientists have explored and helped us understand, which is the role of emotion in making decisions, the role of neurotransmitters. The fact that when our brain circuits in cases of injury and disease interfere with experiencing emotion, it's very hard to decide things. So if we want to do a negotiation, if we want people to have a problem-solving discussion and decide things, their emotions are incredibly important. Indeed, they seem to dominate and have more power than our the rational parts of our mind. This metaphor comes from Jonathan Haidt's wonderful book, The Righteous Mind, in which he talks about our conscious minds as really not able to completely control the subconscious mind, and maybe not even aware of the agendas and some of the things that the subconscious mind is doing. One of the ways we see this show up in the mediation room is what social psychologists and cognitive psychologists call competitive arousal. It's not enough that we succeed, cats must also fail. So when people are in conflict, their protective parts get revved up and they want to win. And we'll talk more about that in the IFS context in a bit. But it's interesting to me that neuroscientists have shown that using functional MRI technology, that people not only like to win, but they feel better about their success, when others have failed. Interestingly, we also have brain circuits, reward circuits that light up when we cooperate. And so again, using the functional MRI technology, you can put people in one of these machines and examine what circuits light up when they play a prisoner's dilemma game in which they cooperate so that everybody wins. And so what we know from this kind of research is that people in general like to cooperate. We also like to win. And I found this very confusing when I first heard about it, but IFS really helps understand about how these parts got started in perhaps in our evolutionary history. I mean, that's not part of the IFS theory, but those are dots that I find interesting to connect. That if you look in the world of our ancestor primates, there's reciprocal altruism, cooperation, and you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, literally as well as figuratively. And then there's social hierarchy and competition. So we have these different circuits, the ones that like to win, the ones that like to cooperate. We inherited those. And so when I first started experiencing these seemingly conflicting impulses, this is not an actual picture of one of my clients, but I remember having a client many, many years ago who alternated from, 1 week to the next, saying we should stick to our guns and fight the good fight here, and other weeks we should settle. And I thought, this person doesn't seems to have, I don't know, maybe some kind of multiple personality disorder, or I know it has different names now, dissociative disorder, but that was not the case. This was a high functioning individual, and what I learned later is this guy had parts like we all do. But back in the early years of my practice, I started practicing law in 1984 when I right after I graduated. I didn't know about IFS. In fact, IFS was sort of in its infancy in the 1980s, if I understand the history correctly. But faced with people who had presented with these conflicting priorities and goals, I thought, I wonder what the prevalence of mental illness is in our society. And I looked it up, and you can find this online. In any given year, 26.2% of the US population is experiencing a diagnosable mental illness. I thought, there's the problem. And in fact, in my practice, I thought the percentage might be higher than that, because maybe people who have diagnosable mental illnesses get into more conflicts than others. And I thought, how am I going to work with people who have these challenges? And so I was led by my late wife, Beth Andrews, to the DSM, which actually was quite helpful. And she pointed out, as I described, with anonymizing the names and identifying information of my clients, we would talk about cases and so forth in ways that didn't compromise privacy and confidentiality. She opened the book to, for example, some of the personality disorders, and I found that yes, some of my clients have this particular diagnosable quote mental illness. I don't think of it in that way anymore, but I did at the time, and I thought it was quite helpful. And in fact, I came upon a psychotherapist who's also a lawyer and mediator, Bill Eddy, who's written a wonderful set of books about what he calls high conflict people, who are basically people who have characterological disorders. And rather than specifying which particular disorder, he just lumps them together and says, these are high conflict people. They find themselves chronically in one conflict after another. And he offers a variety of tools under 4 different headings: bonding, structure, reality testing, and consequences, that he found useful in working with people who fit that description. I thought that these were tremendously helpful tools, and I started using them. And at a certain point, especially after I first became aware of IFS, I started thinking about this model as essentially dehumanizing the clients and pathologizing them and putting them in a box where I wasn't really able to fully engage with them, because I was thinking about them as being different from myself in ways that necessitated my setting certain kinds of boundaries and limits that where I needed to keep my distance. Now, the IFS model, doesn't completely negate the idea that it's important when you're providing a professional service, whether it's as a clinician or as a lawyer or mediator. Boundaries can be important, and having protective parts that help set those boundaries, really useful, really important. That said, I took to heart a comment that I received from a psychologist friend and colleague who said, you talk a lot about this, about personality disorders, and it seems to me that's not how you actually do your mediations. And that pathologizing frame is perhaps not the one that we should be teaching our mediation students. And I tended to agree with that. And here's a picture of Beth back in the day when she was a potter. And a big shout out to her, because she was one of my teachers who taught me about IFS. I think she took level 2 training. I think she was a level 1 program assistant. She was very involved in it. And at a certain point in time, she introduced me to Dick Schwartz, who had been her teacher and trainer in her level 1 training. And then I, in turn, read some of the articles and books that Dick has been writing, and in particular, the introduction to the internal family systems model, which I think for mediators especially is good. But I also think the basic text that he's now updated in the 2nd edition with Martha Sweezy is very accessible, and mediators should definitely consider reading that as well. It was very exciting as I learned more about it to see that, IFS is now well recognized as an evidence-based approach to providing clinical services. This is just one example of such a peer-reviewed study. But this is the gateway book. So for anybody who's watching this, who's a mediator but not an IFS practitioner, or if you know someone who's a mediator and they want to learn more about IFS, I recommend this as the gateway into learning more. So the basic idea. Now, what I'm going to do here, as I describe my journey from the DSM to IFS, is to describe part of what I teach mediators and lawyers. But here the focus is primarily with mediators. So I'm going to just share with you some slides and some visual material that I use as part of that training. So you'll get a sense of, well, what are mediators, learning about IFS? And by the way, I welcome feedback. If you're making some notes on how I could do this better, please send them to me. And I'm still on a learning curve here about the model, and also about how to teach the model. But the basic concept, as we all know, is that people have parts, and that the word family in internal family systems model is kind of a misnomer. I mean, Dick has often said that if he could go back in time, he would have left that word out of the name of the model, because it misleads people into thinking, oh, this is like family systems. And it's not about families. It's about the family-like relationships that our parts have. From the standpoint of being a mediator, and I think this is true for clinicians also, among the many advantages of the IFS model are that it's intuitive and non-pathologizing. And it builds on something that our culture already has baked into it, which we talk about parts all the time. Part of me wants to help you with your crisis, Hargrave, but part of me wants to go to lunch. Part of me says I need to stop drinking like this. Then I think, don't listen to him, he's drunk. Or this one, one part of me loves cats, another part not so much. Or finally this one, half of me loves being a pirate and half of me regrets it. So it's built on, it's not only intuitive and non-pathologizing, but it's built on a principle of empowerment, not a medical model. It's not that the clinician has the answers, or in this case, the mediator has the answers, but rather we're going to help the people that we work with find the answers within by becoming more self-led. So some people listening to this might be thinking, well, wait a second, mediation is not therapy. And I totally agree with that. But it can be therapeutic. And part of the goal of using IFS in the mediation setting is to make the mediation experience therapeutic as opposed to counter-therapeutic. And we have to pay attention to the distinctions between these two activities. This is an article which way back in 1983 helped those of us in the mediation field understand better what the boundaries should be between psychotherapy on the one hand and mediation on the other. I share with my people who take my courses and my trainings that I'm involved in, that there are a lot of books out there for mediators and negotiators that use this model of parts. And these are just 3 of them. So it's not a completely novel idea that understanding about parts is really important from the standpoint of being effective as a mediator. I also share the movie Inside Out as a good way to visualize these different parts at work. And if you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it. The link here is to a trailer, a 2-minute trailer. There's several different trailers for this movie. Is a really helpful way for my trainees to learn about parts. Then I talk about how there are different kinds of parts, and in particular, exiles, managers, firefighters, and these managers and firefighters being the protective parts. And their job is to either counteract the pain of a re-injury of our exiles, or in the case of managers, to prevent re-injury. And then there's self-energy, our seat of consciousness, our heart, our spirit, our soul, etc. And Percy Ballard, who's a friend and colleague, shared with me his metaphor of the smartphone and the different parts, different apps on the smartphone. So I created a visual for that using some of my parts. And people that I train find it useful to think about our exiled parts, for example, shame as one, as a part, not the whole. Our angry firefighter parts, which seem to be self-activating. We don't have to click on those just come right up. In my case, I have a worker part, I have a meditation part. And there's self-energy, which I put down there at the bottom. My phone no longer has one of those home buttons, but somewhere on my operating system, I activate self-energy when I can, and try to make my self-energy sort of resident in my system. The goal of IFS being to be self-led and to have that self-energy sort of available throughout the day. Is part of my goal. Dick Schwartz uses the metaphor, instead of an iPhone, he uses the metaphor of the conductor in the orchestra, which I think is a great metaphor. And I use as a metaphor that self-energy is like the mediator inside us, equipped with all the 8 C words that describe self-energy. And particularly for mediators, curiosity and compassion. So I've covered some personal background, my journey to IFS. Now let's get down to brass tacks, so to speak, and talk about working with clients' parts. So I'm going to share with you 3 different ways that I work with clients' parts in the mediation setting. And the first is working with protectors. The second is reassuring exiles. I'm not really going into, deep healing of exiles. That it's not my training. I don't have a license to practice in that area, but I'm often aware of that people's exiles are playing a big role in a mediation, so reassuring them is helpful, and then accessing the client's self-energy. So back to this client who had these 2 different parts, the part that wanted to settle and the part that wanted to fight the good fight. We can work with those protectors and acknowledge them directly. He was ambivalent, and he, resisted the idea of settlement when I pursued it. He went back to, no, we should fight the good fight. And I can say to him now, or those who have followed, it sounds like part of you wants to settle and part of you hates the idea of giving in. And I get acknowledgement of both of those parts rather than trying to figure out which part is the real client. Another way in which I work with protectors is noticing when I'm serving as the mediator, people's gladiator parts have shown up. And I call them that. I say, you know, the intensity of the conflict in this conversation we're having right now gives me the impression that your gladiator parts are, you know, kind of running this conversation. I'm wondering if you could ask those gladiator parts to take a step back. And they don't have to go away. You might need them at some point, but just take a step back, because that will make more room for your problem-solving parts, and see if we can make some progress that way. And people get that metaphor. I don't have to give them a talk about IFS to help them see how useful that might be to get the gladiator parts to step back a little bit. Of course, the gladiator parts often come right back to the front of the table. And so I asked them, you know, I notice it, I point it out in a non-blaming, non-shaming way. It's good that we have gladiator parts. Our species, you know, has evolved in a way that makes that useful to have protective parts. So those are just a couple of the ways that I engage directly and name and call out people's parts. Reassuring exiles. So here I want to just offer a comment about a workshop that I attended. I think it was at my first IFS conference a bunch of years ago, where Mike Elkin gave a talk about couples counseling, and he was talking particularly about high conflict couples. And he said, you know, with working with that population, the high conflict couples, what each person wants more than anything else is innocence, the feeling of being a good person. And he's pointed out, and this is in a handout, and I have permission to share these ideas from Mike, that this is complicated and motivated by the fact that many of our most easily accessible parts, our exiles, are convinced that we are worthless and unlovable. He points out that fights between members of a couple are usually about the same thing. Who's the better person? Who's more loving, generous, flexible, intelligent, competent, forgiving, and truthful of the pair? And during the fight, each member of the couple tries to prove that the other person is morally defective, bad, and wrong. And the solution is for the other person to stop being a bad person and work towards becoming a good person. So these exiles, the ones that feel like, gee, maybe I'm, you know, I'm partly responsible, or maybe responsible in a big way for this conflict, comes up often in conflict stories. I'm going to share with you two experiences that illustrate the point. This is a story from Myra Gordon, and I have permission from her to share this, you know, changing all the identifying information. I gave a talk that Myra attended where I talked about how mediators can give people the reassurance of saying, it sounds like you're trying to do the right thing, that people really appreciate that acknowledgement of trying to be a good person, and how that's important to people. And so, again, changing the names, she described to me the very next day after I gave this talk, that she'd put this to work in a mediation the next morning. It was so reassuring. Teachers don't often get this kind of wonderful feedback from people that we teach or, you know, or train. So it left a big impression on me. And she told me about this case, small claims court mediation, in which Rick and Steve were longtime friends, and Rick had borrowed $4,200 from Steve to relocate to Florida, and he didn't repay the money. He fell on hard times, and Rick didn't respond to calls, emails, and letters. Steve was trying to get his money back. And in the mediation, Rick described at length all of his setbacks. He had medical problems. He lost his job in Florida. His car broke down, et cetera. And he really wanted to pay Steve more than $4,200, $4,500, but he felt really embarrassed and felt like he had been a bad friend by not responding to Steve. And then at that point, Myra said to Rick, it sounds like you were trying to do the right thing. And at that point, Rick started crying. And these two guys, older guys, knew each other from the neighborhood. My impression from Myra's description is they had never seen each other cry. And as soon as Rick was crying, then Steve started crying. And as a mediator, I can just tell you that if people are sitting there looking into each other's eyes and they are weeping, they are, vulnerable. They are experiencing a self-to-self connection. There's more self-energy in the room when they have let their protective parts take a big step back and really connect with each other. Another story, got to be a New Yorker cartoon. If it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? This is a cartoon sort of illustrates the point about how much we care about being a good person. And that showed up in the room with Steve and Rick. And the lesson, there's a mediation story about an orange, and I won't stop to share the story, but it's basically about how, well, I'll just mention it. Two kids fighting over an orange. The parent cuts the orange in half, says, okay, you each have half, but one wanted the pulp to make juice and one wanted the rind to make a cake. If we had only talked about their interests, they could have had the functional equivalent of a whole orange, each of them. So it's sort of like they could each have an orange. Well, I think goodness is like the cutting the orange story. It's not a zero-sum game. Both people can be good people. And as a mediator, I try to help people see that. This is a story about reassuring exiles in the context of divorce mediation. I've made up the names, of course. So Desmond and Claire are in divorce mediation, and they're battling over money. Claire said to me, I'm concerned that you'll think I'm greedy. Now, Desmond was in the room when she said this. And so I felt like I needed to reassure that exile. And I felt I could do it safely in mixed company with her soon-to-be ex-husband there. And so I said to her, I think there's a part in all of us that cares about money. And it's a really important part. I mean, think about what life would be like if we didn't have a part of us that was paying attention to finances. And I said, but I'm aware that, we all have other parts. You have a part that wants to be a good mom, and a part of you that wants to be a friend to Desmond after the divorce. Those are all important and valid parts. And so is the part that is, concerned about money. And I could see her looking much relieved because I sort of normalized the idea of, caring about money. And I didn't have a mental frame of that being greed. And I noticed Desmond was taking a lot of notes, and I was thinking, here comes the rebuttal. And I said, Desmond, I see you've been taking a lot of notes. And by the way, this is not an actual picture of my clients. But he said, yeah, I've been taking a lot of notes because this is a really useful idea. And I want to think about this some more. And this was, again, a nice teaching moment where I'm sharing some resources and some ideas with clients, and they're, finding them useful. Now, third point under the heading of working with our clients' parts, accessing client self-energy. So here I have a story about a sex discrimination case against a big company in which the plaintiff employee who had been laid off, they said her job was eliminated, but she thought it was sex discrimination. I'm having a separate caucus meeting with just her and her lawyer. It's the end of the day. There's $250,000 on the table, last and final offer, and she needed to decide. She was the primary earner in her family, whether to accept the offer or not. And I said, it sounds like there's a part of you that wants to go the distance because it feels you were treated unlawfully. And she said, absolutely. And I said, and another part of you that's being very practical about the risks of going to trial. And she was concerned it could have, easily taken 2 or 3 years. to try the case? And she said, yes, that too. And I said to her, and my voice got softer, and I said, I think we all have a mediator inside that helps us manage these different parts and helps us make wise decisions. Can you feel that mediator inside you? Now, of course, I was talking about self-energy, but I decided not to use that label. And because, again, it's a metaphor that she found, as it turns out, to be useful. And she paused and got quiet, and she said, yes, I know I need to settle this and move on. And that was a big moment for me in my learning about the IFS model and mediation, because what I realized is I don't have to be an advocate for settlement. I can help people be more self-led as they make their own decisions. Now, I want to talk briefly, I'm going to have to speed this up to get to the finish line on time, talk about working with my own parts. So one of the ways that I do this is when I look at my own parts is that it helps me have compassion for my clients. It also helps me manage my own protectors and access my own self-energy. So increasing compassion toward our clients. So here are some of my parts. You can see them up on the screen. And I have these exiled parts, and I have these manager parts. And this firefighter part, I'll tell you a story about that part. I call it my dumb part, which stands for don't mess up my mediation. This is when one of the participants in a mediation is behaving in ways that are just making my life really difficult. Here's the story of trying to manage that part. So my dumb part used to come to the fore when when I'd notice interruption in the room. And this is a picture of me at the age of 7. And I have a vivid recollection of my father interrupting my brother and me at the dinner table. God bless him, he was a wonderful, generous soul, but he also had this kids should be seen and not heard kind of mentality that he acquired from his parents, no doubt. And when I would be interrupted, and here's me at the age of 7, an exile part was going, well, what about me? Aren't I important? So let's fast forward many, many years in the mediation room, and I've got one of the parties who's constantly interrupting the other parties and interrupting me. And when I asked him, I said, are you willing to abide by the ground rules that we're going to share the airtime? He said, no. And so I overreacted. My dumb part came to the fore, and I folded up my laptop where I keep notes, and I stood up and I said to this guy, he was a lawyer, I said, when you're ready to abide by the ground rules, I'll come back in the conference room and we'll mediate the case. And I walked down the hall to my office and realized when I got there that I had painted myself into a corner that only a bully could release me from. Fortunately, the other parties in the mediation prevailed on this guy. He said, yeah, I'll abide by the ground rules. Okay. So I came back and we mediated the case. But when I learned about the IFS model, it gave me an opportunity to reflect on why I overreacted. And it's because this guy was triggering and re-injuring this exiled part that didn't like to be interrupted. So I've done some work on some healing work with that exile. And so now if people interrupt, I point it out and we figure out some way to manage that, which might involve doing shuttle diplomacy, for example. That's one strategy. Accessing my own self-energy. So for this, I want to share with you a story. Now, I know that in PowerPoint 101, they teach you don't read your slides. Okay, I get that. But I'm going to read my slides because this story by one of my mentors and teachers, Ken Cloak, is so useful. And Ken writes beautifully. And the story is called No More Teachers' Dirty Looks, a case study. And it's about a teacher named Rose, who is a veteran teacher who was being fired for yelling at 3 teachers during school hours using world-class swear words in front of school children. She just had she had a fit. She was raging and she was going to be fired. She had been the chairperson of the union local, was a strong advocate for teachers, and she had just stepped down 6 months before from 20 years of service as the head of the union. In the mediation, the teachers, the three teachers, angrily said what Rose had said and done to them. Rose responded defensively, first by denying that what she had done was so serious, and then by accusing the teachers of having provoked her. And then Ken writes, sensing the determination behind Rose's resistance and also its utter futility, I stopped her in mid-sentence during one of her counterattacks against teachers and said, "Excuse me, Rose, can I ask you a question?" She said, "Yes." And I asked, softening my tone of voice and leaning toward her until I was at the edge of her personal space, "Has anyone ever thanked you for all that you've done for the school?" And Rose's mouth dropped open and she immediately burst into tears and started sobbing uncontrollably. This is Ken writing, I turned to the other teachers and asked if they would each turn to Rose and tell her one thing that she had contributed to the school and thank her for having done it. Now they all started crying as they told their stories of Rose's dedication to the teachers and the school. And as they did this, their accusativeness, her defensiveness, and the atmosphere of impasse were completely transformed. Now, how did Ken know that that was the right question to ask? I think it's because Ken has, I've known him for a bunch of years. He is someone who has a lot of self-energy, and in that moment had access to his self-energy. So I teach my students and people in workshops that when we are self-led, we can connect with the self-energy in others. Now, Dick Schwartz has written a wonderful book chapter called Psychotherapy as a Spiritual Practice. And so building on that and acknowledging Dick's contribution on that point, my friend and colleague, Richard Wallman, and I wrote an article about mediation as a spiritual practice. And that self-to-self connection is what that's all about. Now, if we want to bring peace into the room, and create this self-to-self connection. Thich Nhat Hanh tells us to create peace, we have to be peaceful. We have to be, I don't think self-led is a good way to describe it. And that means unblending from our parts, asking them to take a step back, give our hearts some space. Now, applying this to conflict stories, I use a question that Ken Cloak once asked and Isabel Allende asked, what is truer than the truth? And that's the story. And so I'm going to summarize some of this parts framework in trying to understand the question of why stories, particularly conflict stories, are truer than the truth. Part of it's because of verbal overshadowing. And cognitive psychologists have explained that when we tell a story over and over again, it sort of digs the groove of anger or resentment and angry protective parts even deeper. And that's because these conflict stories are infused with emotion, and particularly the moral dimension of the story. That's what our protective parts in conflict stories are all about, is who's the better person, right? The moral high ground. And so Ken said, when people come into the mediation room, they bring with them three stories. The story of victimhood, in which there is a victim, that's the person who's talking to you, and a villain, and then they're looking to you as the mediator to be the rescuer. And then Ken points out that there is a second story, the story of self-blame, that they very seldom tell, but they're carrying it inside. They may not even be fully aware of it, but the feelings that that story evokes are very present in most people. And, this is all my fault, but they, don't want to share that because that might diminish your feeling of being a rescuer. And then there's this third story. What's the third story? Well, that's the story that explains why we made up the other two stories. So Ken explained this many, many years ago at a workshop of his that I attended. And I thought, wow, this is really helpful in explaining. And then when I learned about IFS, I understood who's telling the stories, that we have these protective parts, we have these exile parts, and we have self-energy. Now, one more tool in the IFS toolbox, which I mentioned in my outline, and that is using IFS to understand our clients' biases and also our own. And I think this has been a major contribution of the IFS fields, the idea that in dealing with racism, dealing with sexism and other kinds of bias, that the idea of trying to exorcise those parts, our bigoted parts, is not a very successful strategy. We all have biased parts. They carry around outmoded messages that our manager parts reject. But they're still there, and we can't vote them off the island. We can't exercise them. What we can do, however, is pay attention to our unbiased and idealistic parts, and try to avoid shaming and trying to suppress the biased parts, because that doesn't heal them, but instead trying to understand them, engaging with those parts with curiosity and compassion. And so bringing our self-energy to the fore and visiting with those bigoted parts can help us learn about them and help in healing them. So at this point, I'm going to stop because I've run out of time. But if you have questions, comments, or concerns about anything in this presentation, please contact me. And I'll conclude with two quotes that I love, especially in the IFS context: Walt Whitman's "I contain multitudes," and Aristotle's comment about the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So namaste, y'all. It's been a pleasure visiting, even though it's sort of electronically with you. And here are the resources. And I hope that this is useful. And I'd love to connect with you in some mode. And I'm now going to stop the recording and stop the screen share, and wish you all a good rest of the day.